You are watching Tech and AI Live. Now we have a great presentation coming up with Matt Beale, Senior Solutions Consultant at CloudFactory, titled 4 Practical Steps to Making Your AI Solutions More Ethical and Successful. Matt is one of CloudFactory's senior solution consultants. He helps clients around the world overcome their data challenges with AI and ML projects across autonomous vehicles, green energy, and fintech. Matt joined CloudFactory due to his interest in ethical issues that impact AI and CloudFactory's mission to create meaningful work in the developing world. Welcome, Matt. It's great to have you here.
Cool. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And why don't we get going with your presentation? The floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you very much. So I'm Matt. So as being said, I'm going to take you through 4 practical steps to making your AI solutions more ethical and successful. We've come up with these steps from working with customers who've been successful and grown their projects to cover the whole world. And we've also taken learnings from across the industry and how we can actually really impact and make a difference to what we're trying to achieve. So first off, a little bit about me. So I'm one of the solutions consultants at CloudFactory. I've been within the IT world for over 10 years. And the first part of my career was helping multinational customers and public sector move their workloads to the public cloud, optimize them within the public cloud. However, now I work within the AI and ML space, advising customers on how to scale their models from small proof of concept, proof of value style engagements into full production-ready AI systems by providing them best-in-class annotation solutions in order to do so. But first off, why do we care about AI ethics? What's the importance to it, and what does it actually mean to you as a business? So 89% of industry leaders say that a company's ethical stance would influence their ability to work together. This is something that we're seeing growing quite rapidly, and the fact that it's nearly 90% is something that we need to directly think about when we're talking to customers, thinking about projects that we're trying to build, and the impact on the image of our companies that we have. It's also fair to say that to scale a business, we need to invest in AI today. Whether that be machine learning, deep learning, or a more simplified AI algorithm is something that we do need to do. However, we have a big challenge. 94% of industry leaders believe that AI is biased, and that causes a big problem with ethics and how we cope with that ethical dilemma that we're bringing ourselves into. But what is AI ethics? If we take the Oxford English Dictionary of what ethics is, it's a set of moral principles, especially ones relating to or affirming a field, a specific group, or form of conduct. Being the OED, it's lovely and wordy and probably a bit more convoluted than what we need. So when we start talking about AI ethics, the definition that I use is that it's based on 3 main principles: truthfulness, righteousness, and sincerity. The challenge we have is bias creeps in. As we've discussed, there is a challenge with bias and how we cope with that. And if something is biased, it's very difficult to be meeting those principles. In a lot of cases, bias and ethics gets used interchangeably. And for a lot of scenarios, that's not really too much of a problem. So we will hear during this talks about bias and ethics reasonably interchangeably. So from that side, take them as somewhat similar. And if you have a bias, you're going to struggle to meet those ethical principles. So it's going to immediately damage the ethical stance of what you're trying to do. Interesting comment from Deepak Agrawal, who was the former VP of AI at LinkedIn. He says that no matter how hard you try, there will always be some inadvertent bias. Every single one of us have biases, whether they be good, bad, or indifferent. That's not important, but there is some bias. We need to be aware of that when we're coming to do this. When we do something within the AI and ML space, we will put the biases we have inadvertently into the systems that we go and create. So what is conventional AI ethics? Where is the conventional thought process with AI ethics? It all sits within the final phase of AI development, the refining and optimizing phase. This is when we're talking about algorithms, how we tweak them, how we optimize them, how we change hyperparameters, all these kind of fun and interesting things. However, that's not really where we want to be. There are 7 steps when it comes to building out an AI algorithm, all the way from data acquisition to model optimization. And this is actually where the real scope of AI ethics is. If we have a failure in any one of these areas, it is going to cause a downstream problem to something that we try and go and create. Really good real-world example of this is the American Automobile Association. found that autonomous driving technology will actually hit cyclists in a third of all tests. Bear in mind, these tests are in fairly laboratory conditions, they're in a lot of control, and are very much not designed to be real-world scenarios, and they're just meant to mimic them as much as possible. And these manufacturers aren't just one manufacturer, by the way. This is across the board. So we're talking Tesla, Hyundai, Subaru, you name it. There are multiple different car manufacturers as part of these tests. And I think we can all agree that hitting a third of cyclists is certainly not an ethical thing. I don't think anyone would want to say that. And this has all come from a data acquisition problem. The data that was used for training all of these algorithms didn't include enough edge cases. It didn't include the cases that were being tested within here. Therefore, those tests were automatically failed. The system didn't know what to do with that. So that causes a big problem and big ethical problem when we're talking about the risk to pedestrians with autonomous vehicles. So what can we do? How can we actually address these ethical issues? Well, the first step is be aware. That's a pretty important piece. You need to be aware that there is a problem. Coming to this conversation, being aware of this conversation is really useful. But there are also some tools that you can go and leverage as well. So we have the Data Ethics Canvas. So this is produced by the Open Data Institute. So it has 15 different elements that you can go look at. And it covers things from the right to use the data, which is actually a much bigger problem than a lot of people think it is. How you engage with shareholders, how you store data. And this is useful not just for AI and ML projects. So even if you're not looking at an AI and ML project today, I'd still recommend looking at a Data Ethics Canvas because it's really useful for any IT-based project. So anything that you've got, whether it be deploying a new application, whether it be how you look at your backup policies, whatever it might be, Data Ethics Canvas is going to have something valuable there for you. If you want to go wider than that, though, we have something called the B Corp assessment. So this will analyze as a whole business the ethical stance. So it's looking at environmental impact, social impact, governance, and how you actually manage all those things within your business. So something a bit wider, but as we discussed very early on, the whole ethical stance of a business is going to be a big impact on working together. Therefore, having stuff like the B Corp impact assessment completed, knowing where you stand with that, is going to put you in a much better stand as we want to grow and as we want to make our companies more successful. The next step is diversity. We have a big challenge within the AI and ML world where we, for our sins, use convenience data sets far too frequently. This doesn't mean convenience data sets are necessarily bad. I'm certainly not saying that there's anything bad about a convenience data set. They are useful for specific uses. If you're building a small proof of concept, using a convenience data set is completely fair. A convenience data set might be something that is local to you. It might be an open source data set. It might be social media. But it's really useful to get you that kind of step up on the ladder. When we're moving into production, though, we want to be scaling that because production, we're not talking about a very localized instance. If you take social media, very much a Western focused audience there. It's typically in highly developed nations and doesn't necessarily counter all the scenarios that we see within the real world. Open source data sets are very similar too. They're quite often produced by universities as research projects or as the result of research projects. And therefore, they're very much focused around the areas around those universities in a lot of cases. Really good example of this is labeled faces in the wild. In the whole data set, there is 78% male faces and 83% white faces. On the right-hand side there, you can see just a snapshot of the labeled faces in the wild dataset. And it's probably fair to say the majority of those are male, white, or both. And that's certainly not representative of what the real world is. So if we were building a facial recognition algorithm, which has a whole other set of ethical implications that we're not going to get into today, it wouldn't be a reasonable thing to do to be building it and basing the whole dataset on that labeled faces in the wild dataset. This means that when we're scaling into production, we need to look at how we curate datasets, actually have new data, and have novel data that will handle all the different situations that we might come up against. If we take the autonomous vehicle example, we need to make sure we can cope with rural and urban settings as we go through it. Step 3 is to have humans in the loop. The yellow sections that I've highlighted there are 80% of the effort that goes into building an AI solution. A lot of the effort is spent in annotation, data cleansing, exception handling, and actually a lot less is spent within model creation, etc. This doesn't mean that you have to use humans exclusively for these pieces. And there's a bit of a misunderstanding that we see where people believe it's all or nothing. Either you use fully automated labeling or you just use humans. Actually, the best solution is to use both. It's to leverage technology and people together. On the right-hand side, we have a classification done by the YOLO classifier. So this is a Newfoundland statue, and I'm sure most of us can agree that's probably a dog. However, YOLO has a 70% confidence that it is in fact a bird, which in this example, there's not a massive risk. It's not really too much of a problem. And if we misclassify a dog as a bird, I don't think anyone's going to get too upset. But when we start scaling that out to bigger, more real-world problems, there can be big impacts with what we do. The other thing that we should also be very careful of and very cognizant of is how we handle exceptions. If there's a low confidence score, we don't want to default to no being the answer. In fact, those exceptions are generally the most valuable data that you go and create, because having those exceptions are the things that you really need to train your model on. It's very easy to create a model on something that is incredibly repeatable. In fact, in a lot of cases, you don't really even need to use machine learning in that case. But if you're using something that is a bit novel, a bit strange, a bit of an edge case, having those automation exceptions handled by a human are really important, because that allows you to start refining the edges of where you are and actually widens the scope of the AI and ML algorithms that you're developing. So just because your machine says it's a 30% confidence score, do not discard that. Actually, immediately pass that to a human, have the human look at it and come up with an answer, because that's going to make your AI algorithms really excel. The last step is using frameworks. So there are many frameworks out there. There are more than I can fit on a page. Here are just a few that we can go and look at and leverage. So the first thing is the Turing Institute's Project Explain. So this is more focused on the traditional set of explainability within AI. So we're talking very much around models and algorithms here. So this is how we add explainability and transparency into the algorithms that we create. So we want to be looking at how we can work out what hyperparameters are really important that go into defining an outcome. Being able to actually investigate the neural net and actually understand what the decisions are and how those impact, how those changes impact on the outcomes. When we go a little bit wider, we look at Google's responsible AI framework. So this includes things like inclusivity, diversity of input, making sure that people are not individually identifiable within a data set. However, this is not a checklist. Don't just go on there and go, cool, here's 10 items that we can do. We'll tick each one off. And by the end of it, that means we're ethical. It's very much not that. It's to give you guidance. It's to give you a framework to build with and make decisions alongside. And that's where the focus of that is. We're also starting to see legal frameworks come in. So legislation. So a really good example of this is the EU's proposed legal framework for AI development. So this is looking at how we define risk, how we define harm of algorithms. If we take a really low risk scenario, we can look at that dog and bird classifier. It's not massively important to humans whether we classify something as a dog or a bird or misclassify it. If we take a step up and look at autonomous vehicles, there's obviously a very real risk to humans. If we take the scenario we had with the American Automobile Association, where there were autonomous vehicles hitting cyclists, there's obviously a big risk there. Therefore, there would be a much higher amount of legislation that gets put in there, a much greater amount of control that needs to be put in. Then we can take the further step and go military technology. We're only at the very beginning of AI, machine learning, and deep learning going into military-based applications, but they obviously have the greatest risk that's associated with the outcome there. There's also the wider impact of what we're doing. So what we've just talked about there, those first three frameworks are very much around the AI project itself, but we need to also think of the ethical impact of everyone who's part of it. All those yellow sections that I highlighted, the stuff that is generally where a lot of the effort in, is quite often sourced on the global south. typically people who are south of the equator. And there have been several cases where that has negatively impacted those environments. You might think providing jobs out there is a good thing, but you need to provide them in the right way. It needs to benefit the communities. It needs to be something that actually is beneficial. This is typically called impact sourcing within the industry, and being able to look for those kind of partners helps you really build an ethical framework. Also helps you try and be truly ethical as you go through with what you're trying to achieve. So how are companies actually handling this today? We've obviously talked very much around the theory of what we can do and how we can do it, but we want to make sure that we're actually doing this in an ethical stance, and what are actual real world companies doing to try and achieve this. We have a video from Tyranny, one of our customers, works at compoundeye, around how they actually address these challenges.
My name is Tyranny Duncan. I'm Director of Product at compoundeye. compoundeye is a team of 20 scientists and researchers who spent the last 7 years building a visual system for machines using passive sensors like automotive-grade cameras and IMUs. We enable robots to understand the world around them in dense 3D, so at 10 times the resolution of other sensors like LiDAR and radar. My background is in transportation and planning, also geospatial systems, and I care a great deal about the intersection of hardware, software, and public right-of-way. At compoundeye, I spend every day working with some of the leading most experts in artificial intelligence and computer vision. The biggest challenge to bringing autonomous vehicles to customers in all geographies is scaling. Scaling is the fundamental challenge of this technology. Developing it just in one city has taken much longer than folks in the industry anticipated. By contrast, something like L2, L3 ADAS can scale across multiple geographies quite rapidly. So that's why compoundeye is more focused on addressing known safety issues and more tractable operational domains. So we're taking this value-driven, incremental approach and advancing autonomy in both on-road and off-road environments. This could be seen as antithetical to the sort of inspiring, but also very expensive in shop mentality. So compoundeye uses parallax, motion parallax, and semantic cues to generate our perception outputs. When you train models on both parallax and semantic cues, you get better results on both. You also need substantially less data for the perception stack to perform reliably when you are providing actual scene geometry using techniques like parallax. Part of the reason why 3D scene geometry is so important is that the machine doesn't need to have a prior understanding of every possible object it can encounter to make a decision about it. AI hype has been sort of fundamental to this autonomous vehicle hype. You can chase that thread forever, but the reality is that safety critical operations using pure AI have very limited operational domains. There is a middle ground. You can't just say in autonomous vehicle market that it's either all machine learning versus you need a LiDAR to recover accurate scene geometry. compoundeye uses automotive grade cameras to recover dense scene geometry and uses that scene geometry to bolster the strengths of machine learning approaches. Addressing the known safety issues as affordably as possible is what will allow us to do it at scale without reinventing the transportation system or needing to change people's mobility habits. The ethical part for us is focusing on these short-term opportunities and more commonplace operational domains that can scale to a whole bunch of people, not just folks living in one geography. Our goal is to provide as many people as possible with industry-leading perception on vehicles that exist today so that we can build for a safer future. How does this differ from some of our competitors? So we are one of very few perception companies using cameras. Although stereo cameras are a proven technology, the advances in camera technology in the last 10 years is just astounding. We are actually the only camera-first perception company that uses stereo parallax in addition to motion parallax and semantic cues. In other words, we're the only perception company in the world that uses the complementary power of 3D scene geometry created by cameras and artificial intelligence to get better results on both.
So that was a bit from Tyranny there. So compoundeye are one of the over 500 companies that we've helped throughout our life. So we're a data services partner. We've actually delivered over 25 million hours of annotations and data processing to companies. And actually nearly 7 million of that was delivered just last year alone, with a 43% increase in what we've done the previous year. One of our big focuses is a very positive customer experience. So we have an NPS score 62, which is very much a highly positive score. We also grade ourselves on a positive cloud worker experience. So we're the people who do the data annotation work. So for that, we also have an NPS score in the 60s. We have an average tenure of over 18 months, which is pretty much unheard of within the industry. The reason for that is we make a big impact on the communities that we serve. So we have a very big focus on community service projects, with over 1,500 days of community service projects delivered just last year alone. So we make sure that we make a big impact to those communities whilst also making a big impact to our customers. If you'd like to hear more, then obviously feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. There's also a lot of my colleagues here today who you can go and find and go and have a chat to as well.
Thanks so much for that, Matt. It was really interesting, and I think it's really important to discuss ethics with AI. You can't really have one without the other. It's a really, really crucial topic. So thank you for sharing that with us. We have had some questions from the audience, so I just want to get stuck into some of those. So first of all, obviously you outlined all those different steps, and how many of them can be done retrospectively?
So other than the first one, which is kind of be aware at the start, which obviously is a bit of a challenge to be doing once you've kind of got to the end of a project, you can retroactively do a lot of that. Even some of the elements of that being aware is still something you can look at retrospectively. And actually, there's always learnings to go into new projects. We very rarely find customers who are, okay, we've built one algorithm, this is the only thing we're ever going to do. There is normally here is the next one, or here's the one after that. And it means that actually looking back historically at what you've done, how you can improve it and grow for the future is quite important. Some of the elements, especially around how you do exception handling, for example, that can be very easily retrospectively added into a system. Some of the frameworks, they can be retrospectively added in. So it is possible. I wouldn't say it's necessarily easy. It's certainly easier if you start at the beginning, doing everything following that process, but it certainly is something you can do.
That's great. And I think a lot of our audience will be pleased to know that there's a lot of it you can do retrospectively. And then those ones that maybe haven't started on their AI journey will know what the best way is to go about it from the beginning. So do you think this, does this replace explainable artificial intelligence?
So explainable artificial intelligence, or XAI as it's quite often called, isn't a replacement for it. In fact, it's designed to complement XAI. So XAI is what you would have seen in kind of the more traditional approaches to it, where we're looking at it from an algorithmic perspective. So we want to, with XAI, define what the algorithm is doing, how it's processing it, what hyperparameters are important. And actually, that kind of leans into what we're talking about with the Project Explain from the Turing Institute, where we want that kind of explainability within the algorithm. So very much a complementary piece. If you're focusing on an XAI project today, don't drop it and suddenly follow this and ignore what you've done. Certainly carry on doing it, but be cognizant that it is not the only answer to the question. We want to make sure that we're looking not just at algorithms, but also the whole impact of it. Because if we focus on algorithms, we can end up inadvertently biasing the outcome with data, which is something we cannot solve just with algorithms alone.
Brilliant. It's great that they can kind of work together, which is always good to hear. And this is a really interesting question, because obviously at our event, we have the pleasure of being joined by executives and business people from all levels of the organization. So is this something that just managers or like product owners should care about, or is this kind of something more for the wider team to consider and kind of unpick for themselves?
So I think it needs to be aware at that management level. There needs to be a directive, is probably too much of a strong word, but kind of a leadership from that side of, okay, here is something we want to go and do, because there is an investment that needs to be made. In terms of the hours, it's not a free thing to do. You can't just go, cool, we're going to tick some boxes and it's all magically solved. It's certainly something you need to put some effort into. However, there will be multiple teams involved with this. So if we take, for example, some of the pieces on the Open Data Institute's piece, where we're talking around how we store data, that's probably not going to be within just an AI person's remit or even a manager's remit. That would be within a security team or a security operations team. So they need to be involved with part of those processes. There will be pieces from an algorithmic perspective that you want to go and have your developers make sure they're actually adding in a method for explainability and a method to actually interrogate the algorithm from that side. So there will be different people from different levels who are going to be responsible for elements of it. However, you want to have someone at a relatively senior level who's overseeing the project, because it's quite easy for someone to start on this and then get distracted. And I'm sure all of us in our working lives have started a project, got distracted halfway through, and then realized 6 months later we should have finished that project that we all started. So we want to make sure that there is that kind of governance perspective, and that person's looking at it from a governance level rather than necessarily an implementation level. And it's generally for people who are more on the ground, the people who are actually doing the development, actually running the security teams to actually be implementing a lot of these pieces and making sure they can feed back into it. There's a lot of what we see is there is a focus from the top to go, cool, this is something we want to go and do. We see a business value in it, we want to go and do it. But actually the really important feedback is coming the other way of, this is where we are today. How can we go and improve what we're doing today and actually make it better? Because quite often people who are more senior in an organization don't necessarily get to see that. And actually that feedback is really important to be able to take on board.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks so much. And I think we'll have to wrap it up there. It's kind of all we've got time for. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We all really appreciate it. And I'm sure the audience has appreciated what you've had to say as well. So thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks to the audience for watching. Make sure you stay tuned to check out the rest of our speakers for Tech and AI Live.